The static was a living thing. It hissed and popped through the speakers of the Tactical Operations Center, a venomous counterpoint to the rhythmic dripping of condensation from an overworked air conditioning unit. On the main screen, a satellite feed showed the jagged spine of the Torren Valley, a geographic nightmare of sheer cliffs and narrow ravines deep in contested territory. 3 green icons, designated Pathfinder Platoon, were clustered behind a rocky outcrop, unmoving. A constellation of red icons, dozens of them, were methodically closing in, squeezing the life out of the position. Pathfinder 6, this is Voknut Actual. What's your status? Over. Colonel Marcus Travers' voice was clipped, strained. He stood with his hands braced on the central console, his knuckles white. The reply was a burst of gunfire, then a ragged breath. Actual 6. We are pinned. Enemy has the high ground on both ridges. ZSUs and heavy mortars. We can't move, we can't breathe. Extraction window is negative. They've got this place zeroed. We tried to break west, lost 2 men. The voice of Lieutenant Hayes was young, frayed to the point of breaking. First pass from the Vipers was torn to shreds. I don't see a way out of this box, sir. The enemy's disposition was a masterpiece of tactical cruelty. They had intentionally funneled Pathfinder into the valley's narrowest point, a natural kill box. The cloud ceiling hung low and thick, a shroud of slate gray that defeated high-altitude precision strikes. The 2 F-16s sent in for a low-level gun run had limped back to base, their fuselages riddled with holes from a terrifyingly dense network of man-portable air defense systems and brutally effective 23mm anti-aircraft cannons. Travers slammed a fist on the console, not in anger, but in sheer, suffocating frustration. Get me a solution, he growled to the assembled staff. A real one. Now. The room was a frantic hum of analysts pulling up weather data, drone feeds, and asset availability charts. The answers were all the same. Too much risk. Unacceptable loss potential. The models predicted a 98% probability of any conventional air asset being shot down on approach. From the back of the room, a junior signals intelligence officer, barely old enough to shave, cleared his throat. Sir, there's Major Rostova. Her aircraft is rated for extreme low-altitude operations. The name fell into the room like a stone, silencing the hum. Every eye turned to Colonel Travers. His face tightened, a mask of rigid skepticism. Major Eva Rostova, he said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. You mean the pilot who thinks flight regulations are a friendly suggestion? The one whose entire service record reads like a dare? He strode over to a secondary monitor and pulled up her file. The screen filled with a stark, unsmiling photo of a woman in her late 30s, her eyes a shade of gray that seemed to absorb light. Below it was a long list of official reprimands nestled uncomfortably beside a shorter, but more potent, list of commendations for valor. Unauthorized maneuvers. Ignoring direct orders to disengage. Pushing an airframe past its documented structural limits. This valley is a meat grinder, son, Travers said, his voice low and dismissive. It demands surgical precision, and absolute adherence to protocol. It requires a scalpel. Rostova is a sledgehammer. She's a reckless, undisciplined variable we cannot afford right now. The Sijan officer shrank back, but didn't back down completely. Sir, with respect, the scalpels aren't working. Maybe a sledgehammer is what we need. Travers' jaw clenched. He stared at the tactical map, at the 3 green icons slowly being choked by the tide of red. He saw the faces of the men he'd sent into that valley. He hated variables. He hated cowboys. He hated being left with no other choice. Get her on the line, he commanded, the words clipped and bitter. He turned back to the main screen, ignoring the murmur of disbelief that rippled through the TOC. Tell Major Rostova her presence is requested. He didn't say required. He didn't say ordered. It was a subtle, institutional jab, a final assertion of his disapproval. He was authorizing the mission, but he was making it clear that he considered it an act of desperation, not strategy. The mission was impossible, and he was sending in a pilot he deemed just as impossible. The call found Major Eva Rostova not in a briefing room or a pilot's lounge, but in the cavernous quiet of Hangar 7. The air was thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid, spent jet fuel, and ionized air from the humming power carts. She stood beside her aircraft, and a 10C Thunderbolt II, an ugly, brutally functional machine that pilots either loved or scorned. There were newer, faster, sleeker jets on the flight line, but this one was hers. She called it Fenrir. It was an old wolf of a plane, its gray skin a patchwork of mismatched panels and sealant lines that told the story of a dozen battles. Scars from shrapnel and small arms fire were visible if you knew where to look, each one repaired but never truly hidden. She wasn't waiting for orders. She was simply there, running a gloved hand along a particularly nasty-looking scar near the cockpit. A long, jagged line left by a 145mm round over some forgotten desert. It was a ritual, a silent conversation with the machine. She felt the vibrations of the auxiliary power unit thrumming through the soles of her boots, a familiar, steady heartbeat. The ground crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant named Riggs, approached her with a data slate. He didn't speak, merely held it out. Eva took it, her eyes scanning the tactical overlay of the Torren Valley. She saw the entrapped ground unit, the suffocating enemy presence, the reported AA emplacements. She absorbed the data in seconds, her expression unchanging. She saw the impossible kill box, the low cloud cover, the reported failure of the fast movers. Her mind was already working, calculating vectors, threat cones, and terrain masking routes. Where Colonel Travers saw an unsolvable equation, she saw a complex but distinct path. She handed the slate back to Riggs. He gestured to the ordnance being loaded onto the wings. A mix of Maverick missiles, high-explosive rockets, and a full drum of 1,174 rounds for the Gu-8 Avenger cannon that formed the plane's nose. Standard SAS loadout, Major? Eva shook her head once, a short, sharp motion. She pointed to two of the Maverick missiles. Swap them. Cluster munitions. Then she tapped the rocket pods. And replaced the He with Willie Pete white phosphorus. For marking and for terror. Riggs raised an eyebrow. Cluster bombs were area denial weapons, not precision tools. White phosphorus was messy. It wasn't a loadout for a surgical strike. It was a loadout for a brawl. You got it, Major. He knew better than to question her. He'd seen her fly. He'd seen the state Fenrir came back in, and he'd seen the battle damage reports from the other side. He trusted her instincts more than any four-star general's battle plan. Eva turned and walked towards the crew locker room, her movements economical and precise. There was no wasted motion, no pre-flight jitters. She pulled on her G-suit, the material stiff and reassuring. She strapped the survival vest over her flight suit, the weight of the gear familiar and centering. On the shoulder of her suit was a single custom patch. A stylized gray wolf's head with glowing red eyes. It was unauthorized, of course, just like the faint wolf's eye she'd painted herself on Fenrir's nose, hidden amongst the grime and battle scars. Her helmet sat on a bench, her call sign Valkyrie, stenciled in low visibility gray on the back. She picked it up, feeling its weight. As she lowered it over her head, the world outside muted, replaced by the soft hiss of the internal comms and the hum of the helmet's electronics. The chaos of the base, the skepticism of command, the fear in the TOC. It all faded away. There was only the mission now. She clicked the oxygen mask into place, the seal tight against her face, her breathing becoming a rhythmic, mechanical sound in her own ears. It was time to go to work. The taxi to the runway was short. From his tower, Colonel Travers watched the ugly, straight-winged jet lumber into position. It looked antiquated, slow, a relic from a different era compared to the sleek delta-winged fighters it shared the base with. It looked like a mistake. He held the microphone for the command channel, his thumb hovering over the transmit button, a final, parting shot of doubt ready on his tongue. He wanted to tell her to stick to the ingress plan, to not take any unnecessary risks. But he knew it would be pointless. She would fly her own mission. He remained silent, watching as the A-10's twin engines spooled up, their high-pitched whine deepening into a hungry roar that vibrated in the tower's thick glass. The jet moved, ponderously at first, then accelerating with a brutal sense of purpose, lifting into the gray, unforgiving sky. The world inside the cockpit was a bubble of focused intensity. Eva Rostova, now Valkyrie, was no longer just a pilot. She was the central nervous system of the weapon she commanded. Her hands, covered in dark gray flight gloves, rested on the stick and throttle, not gripping, but sensing. Through them, she felt the subtle shudders of the airframe, the strain of the control surfaces biting into the thick, humid air. Her head moved in constant, fluid scans, from the heads-up display projecting glowing green symbology onto the armored glass before her, to the multifunction displays flanking the instrument panel, to the sky outside the canopy. She was flying low. Not just low, but recklessly, suicidally low by any conventional standard. Traver and the mission planners in the TOC had laid out an ingress corridor at 5,000 feet. A compromise altitude meant to stay below the worst of the cloud cover, while remaining above the effective range of small arms. Valkyrie had ignored it the moment she cleared the base's perimeter. Fenrir was a creature of the earth, not the sky. It was designed to live in the mud, down where the fight was. Eva flew it accordingly. She kept the plane's belly just a few hundred feet off the rolling hills and arid plains, following the contours of the land like a river. The ground proximity warning system, the automated voice affectionately known as Bitching Betty, should have been screaming at her. Pull up, but Eva had disabled it. She didn't need a machine to tell her where the ground was. She could feel it, a palpable pressure wave buffeting the aircraft. The terrain rushed towards her, a blur of ochre and dusty green. The sensation of speed at this altitude was immense, visceral. She wasn't flying over the landscape, she was hurtling through it. A ridgeline would swell up before her, and she would give the stick a gentle, precise nudge, lifting the A-10's heavy frame just enough to skim over the crest before dipping back down into the valley on the other side. This was terrain masking, using the Earth itself as a shield against enemy radar. To any distant listening post, Fenrir was just a ghost, a fleeting anomaly lost in the ground clutter. On the comms, the TOC was an anxious presence.
Valkyrie, Valknut actual.
We're not tracking you on primary radar. Acknowledge. Eva keyed her mic, her voice calm, her breathing even.
Actual, Valkyrie.
Intentional. Staying under the radar horizon. On course to target area, her words were clipped. Efficient. She didn't offer explanations or justifications. She stated facts. A pause, then Traver's voice, tight with frustration. Major, your flight plan puts you at 5,000 AGL. Your current altitude is dangerously unconventional. Copy actual, was her only reply. She nudged the throttle forward a fraction of an inch, pushing deeper into hostile territory. The sun was beginning its slow descent, and the shadows in the ravines were growing long and dark. The light was failing, which was both a blessing and a curse. It would make her harder to see, but it would also make navigating the treacherous terrain by sight that much more difficult. She felt a change in the air, a subtle turbulence as she entered the foothills bordering the Torren Valley system. The landscape became more aggressive, the hills sharpening into jagged peaks. This was the threshold. She flicked a switch on her control panel, the master arm switch. A satisfying clunk echoed in the cockpit. The symbology on her HUD changed, weapons indicators glowing from a safe, placid yellow to a vibrant, menacing green. Fenrir was no longer just flying. It was hunting. Through the canopy, she could see the dark, angry clouds that choked the peaks ahead. This was the weather system that had stymied the F-16s. For them, it was a barrier. For her, it was cover. She flew directly towards the storm front, letting the tendrils of mist and low-hanging clouds swallow the A-10. The world outside turned to a swirling gray void. The jet bucked and shuddered as it hit the turbulent air. Eva didn't fight it. She rode the currents, her inputs on the controls small and instinctive, like a surfer adjusting their weight on a board. She was flying by instruments now, her eyes locked on the digital attitude indicator and the terrain-following radar display. She was a ghost in the storm, an unseen, unheard predator approaching the killing ground. The enemy in the valley below felt secure. They had beaten back 2 of the coalition's best fighters. They controlled the high ground. Their laughter, carried on the wind, was one of arrogant confidence. They scanned the skies above, waiting for another foolish high-speed pass. They never thought to look into the storm clouds gathering at the mouth of the valley itself. Valkyrie broke through the last veil of cloud with the suddenness of a raptor bursting from cover. One moment she was in the gray, the next she was in the Tauren Valley. The transition was breathtaking and brutal. The world resolved itself in an instant. Sheer rock walls on either side, a muddy riverbed below, and at the far end, the unmistakable muzzle flashes of Pathfinder's desperate defense. The enemy was stunned. An aircraft, an A-10, had just materialized out of the storm front, barely 500 feet above the valley floor. It was impossible. There was a moment of collective disbelief on the ridges, a frozen tableau of open mouths and widening eyes. Eva felt a cold, calm clarity descend upon her. The world slowed. Her senses, heightened by adrenaline, took in every detail. She saw the glint of a scope on the eastern ridge, the dark shape of a ZSU-23-4 Shilka half hidden in a cluster of rocks, the plumes of smoke from mortar tubes. Her eyes tracked the streams of tracer fire arcing towards Pathfinder's position, and her mind instantly calculated the origin points. She didn't wait for target designation from the ground. She didn't need it. Her thumb moved to the weapon select switch on her stick, selecting the GU-8 Avenger. A low, hungry whine filled the cockpit as the 7-barrel cannon began to spool up, the sound vibrating through the entire airframe, a promise of violence. Her first target was an armored personnel carrier that had brazenly advanced into the open, its heavy machine gun pinning down one of Pathfinder's fire teams. It was the linchpin of the enemy's immediate assault. Eva lined up the shot, the pipper on her HUD laying perfectly over the vehicle's engine block. Her finger tightened on the trigger. She didn't hold it down. She squeezed once, a single disciplined burst. BRRRRT. The sound was not a sound. It was a physical event. For less than a second, the A-10 unleashed a torrent of 30mm depleted uranium rounds. On the ground, it was as if the sky had torn open. The shells, each the size of a milk bottle, struck the APC with unimaginable kinetic force. The vehicle didn't just explode. It ceased to exist. One moment it was a 10-ton steel box. The next it was a rapidly expanding cloud of fire, smoke, and shredded metal. The shock wave from the impact visibly rippled across the valley floor. The enemy's confident assault dissolved into chaos. The infantry who had been using the APC for cover were vaporized or thrown like dolls. The heavy machine gun fell silent. The comms exploded. Jesus Christ. TOC, who is that? Who the hell is that? It was Hayes, the Pathfinder leader, his voice a mixture of terror and awe. In the TOC, every analyst and officer was on their feet, staring at the gun camera feed that had just flickered to life. They saw the valley from the A-10's perspective, the perfect, devastatingly efficient strike. Colonel Traver leaned into his microphone, his earlier skepticism momentarily forgotten, replaced by a stunned respect. Pathfinder 6, he said, his voice steady but carrying a new weight. That's your air support. Call sign Valkyrie. The name hung in the air, both on the ground and in the command center. For the soldiers of Pathfinder, it was the name of their salvation. For the enemy, it was the name of the ghost that had just appeared in their midst. And for Eva Rostova, it was simply who she was. She banked Fenrir hard, the G-forces pushing her down into her seat, and lined up her next run. The battle for the Tauren Valley had just begun. The enemy's initial shock curdled into furious, panicked action. They were seasoned fighters, not conscripts, and their discipline, though rattled, quickly reasserted itself. The laughter was gone, replaced by shouted orders and the frantic swiveling of heavy weapons. They had underestimated the threat, and now they sought to correct that mistake with overwhelming firepower. The air around Valkyrie's A-10 suddenly became thick with lethality. The ZSUs on the ridges, which had been scanning the higher altitudes, depressed their quad-barreled cannons and opened up. Streams of green and red tracers reached out for her, lacing the gray sky in deadly patterns. It was like flying through a swarm of angry, phosphorescent hornets. On the valley floor, infantrymen shouldered their manpads, the infrared seekers of the missiles desperately trying to lock onto the heat from Fenrir's twin engines. Eva was no longer just a predator. She was prey. The cockpit lit up with warnings. A sharp, insistent chirp indicated a missile launch. A lower-pitched growl told her a radar system was painting her. She didn't panic. Her movements remained economical, precise. Her left hand danced over the countermeasures panel, punching out flares, brilliant balls of burning magnesium designed to decoy the heat-seeking missiles. She jinked the A-10 hard left, then right, throwing the plane into a series of violent, unpredictable banks. She wasn't just dodging. She was using the valley's terrain as a shield. She would dive behind a rocky spur to break a radar lock, then pop up just long enough to fire a volley of rockets into a cluster of enemy infantry before diving back into cover. The G-forces were immense, a crushing weight that tried to pull the blood from her head. She grunted with the strain, her practiced breathing techniques keeping her conscious and clear-headed. From the ground, Pathfinder watched in awe. They saw the A-10 weave a seemingly impossible path through the web of anti-aircraft fire. It was less like flying and more like a violent aerial ballet. "Valkyrie, be advised." Hayes's voice crackled over the radio, the urgency clear. "They're adapting. RPG teams moving up the eastern slope, trying to get above you for top-down shots. Copy 6. I see them," Eva replied, her voice strained by the GS but still perfectly calm. On her portside MFD, she magnified the view from her targeting pod, the infrared sensor cutting through the gloom. She could see them plain as day, half a dozen figures scrambling up the rocks, long tubes on their shoulders. In the TOC, the atmosphere had transformed. The skeptical quiet was gone, replaced by the focused hum of a team fully engaged. Colonel Traver was no longer a dismissive authority figure. He was Valkyrie's eyes and ears. He stood hunched over the main tactical display, relaying information with a new sense of partnership.
Valkyrie, actual.
"We're painting a heavy mortar position for you at grid 745921. It's behind a ridge. You won't have a direct line of sight." "Copy actual," Eva said. She was already one step ahead. A direct attack was impossible. So, she wouldn't attack directly. She pulled the A-10 into a steep climb, exposing herself to the ZSUs for a terrifying 3 seconds. Tracers whipped past her canopy, so close she could hear the air crackle. Just as the enemy gunners corrected their aim, she rolled the plane onto its back and released a pair of CBU-105 cluster bombs. The bombs didn't fall straight down. Thrown by the A-10's upward momentum, they arced high into the air, over the ridge that was shielding the mortar pit. For a moment it looked like a miss. Then, at the apex of their trajectory, the canisters burst open, releasing dozens of smaller, intelligent submunitions. Each skeet deployed a small parachute, scanned the ground below for the heat signature of an active mortar tube and its crew, and then fired an armor-penetrating slug downwards. For the mortar team, death came from directly above, from a clear sky. A series of sharp, percussive cracks echoed through the valley as the hidden position was systematically annihilated. Traver watched the satellite feed, his jaw tight. It was a brilliant, unorthodox solution to a complex tactical problem. Rostova hadn't just destroyed the target. She had used a weapon designed for armored columns to perform a high-angle, indirect fire mission. It was something he'd never seen before. He was beginning to understand. Her recklessness wasn't a lack of discipline. It was a different kind of discipline altogether, an instinctive, fluid understanding of combat geometry that couldn't be taught in a simulator. He keyed his mic, "Good effect on target, Valkyrie. Mortars are down." His voice was different now. The professional distance was still there, but the icy skepticism had melted away, replaced by a grudging, growing respect. He was no longer giving her orders, he was providing support. He was trusting her to win the fight. Eva didn't acknowledge the praise. She was already banking, diving back towards the valley floor, her next target already in her sights. The enemy commander, a cunning and resilient man, had realized she was drawing their fire to protect the pinned-down soldiers. So he changed tactics again. He ordered his men to ignore the A-10 and focus all their firepower on Pathfinder's position in a final, overwhelming assault. It was a race. Could he wipe out the soldiers on the ground before the angel of death in the sky could wipe out his forces? The volume of fire directed at Pathfinder intensified tenfold. The rocks they were hiding behind began to chip and splinter under the onslaught. "Valkyrie, they're rushing us," Hayes screamed into the radio. "They're coming from all sides. We can't hold. Hold your position." 6. Eva's voice cut through the static, a blade of pure steel. "I'm coming." The escalation had reached its peak. It was no longer about survival. It was about dominance. And Eva Rostova was about to show them what that truly meant. The greatest threat remained. Nestled in a shallow cave high on the western ridge was a ZSU-23-4 Shilka, the same one she'd spotted on her first pass. It was the alpha predator of this valley, its radar-guided cannons commanding a perfect field of fire over the only viable landing zone for an extraction helicopter. It sat in a protected position, shielded from the front by a thick buttress of rock. A conventional bombing run was impossible. A missile strike would likely just hit the rock face. The crew inside felt invulnerable. They had watched her dance through their comrades' fire, and they were waiting patiently for her to make a mistake. Eva knew she couldn't leave it there. No rescue chopper could survive even a 2-second burst from that gun. She had to eliminate it, and she had to do it now. The problem was one of physics and angles. She needed to get a weapon inside that cave, or bring the cave down on top of it. Her mind raced, sifting through 1,000 hours of flight time, 100 different combat scenarios. An idea sparked, a maneuver so dangerous, so utterly contrary to every established doctrine, that it had no official name. It was something she had practiced only in the deep, empty canyons of a desert training range, a move born of a pilot's desperate imagination. "Actual Valkyrie," she said, her voice betraying no hint of the insane risk she was about to take. "Going offline for ordnance delivery. Keep the extraction bird at 5 miles out." "Copy, Valkyrie," Trevor replied, a knot of tension tightening in his stomach. He had no idea what she was planning, but the cold finality in her tone told him it was going to be the deciding moment of the battle. Eva pushed the stick forward, sending Fenrir into a steep dive. She didn't head towards the ZSU. Instead, she dropped the A-10 into the very bottom of the valley, so low that her wingtips were just feet from the canyon walls. The muddy riverbed became her personal trench, the churning water just a blur beneath her canopy. She was now flying below the ZSU's line of sight, masked by the curvature of the valley itself. The G-forces were positive now, pushing her up against her harness, but she knew that was about to change. The ride was violently turbulent, the air thick and compressed between the narrow walls. She flew the plane with her entire body, feeling the currents through the stick, making constant, minute adjustments with the rudder pedals. The cave housing the Shilka was approaching fast on her left. The enemy crew inside would be hearing her now, the thunder of her engines echoing off the rocks, but they wouldn't be able to see her or get their guns depressed far enough to engage. "Now," she whispered to herself. At the last possible second, as she flew parallel to the cave entrance, she hauled back on the stick with everything she had and slammed the rudder pedal. It was a move she called the Viking climb. The A-10, a plane never designed for high-G aerobatics, responded with a groan of tortured metal. The nose pitched up violently, pulling the aircraft into a nearly vertical climb. For a terrifying instant, she was perfectly exposed. The G-forces reversed, slamming her down into her seat with the force of 9 times her own body weight. Her vision grayed at the edges, the blood threatening to drain from her head. Alarms screamed in the cockpit, stall warnings, over-G warnings, a cacophony of electronic protest. The airframe shuddered, vibrating on the very edge of structural failure. The crew of the ZSU stared in disbelief. The A-10 had appeared from directly below them, climbing like a rocket. Their moment of shock gave them the split second Eva needed. Her thumb found the rocket fire button. She didn't fire at the ZSU. She fired at the cliff face above it. A salvo of 12 white phosphorus rockets shot from their pods, trailing thick plumes of smoke. They struck the ancient, weathered rock with ferocious power. But it wasn't the explosion that was the real weapon. It was the thermal shock. The intense, instantaneous heat of the willy peat hitting the cold, damp rock caused it to crack and fracture on a massive scale. A deep, groaning sound, louder than any explosion, echoed through the valley. The entire cliff face above the cave began to shift. Great fissures appeared, and then, with a final agonizing crunch, a landslide of thousands of tons of rock and earth broke free. The ZSU crew had just enough time to look up before their world was obliterated. The avalanche of stone cascaded downwards, burying the cave, the anti-aircraft gun, and its crew under a mountain of debris. It was a geological kill, a feat of airmanship and audacity that defied belief. Eva crested the top of her climb, her vision returning as she leveled out. The stall warnings fell silent. Fenrir had held together. Below her, a vast cloud of dust marked the ZSU's tomb. The most dangerous piece on the board had been removed. The landing zone was clear. With the primary anti-aircraft threat neutralized, the tide of the battle turned decisively. The extraction chopper, a heavy CH-53C Stallion callsign Mover 1, was cleared to enter the valley. But the enemy on the ground, deprived of their heavy support, fought with the desperation of a cornered animal. They launched one last, frenzied charge against Pathfinder's position, hoping to overrun them before the helicopter could land. Valkyrie became the shepherd of that extraction. She put Fenrir into a tight, circular orbit around the beleaguered soldiers, a snarling iron angel holding the wolves at bay. Her mission shifted from targeted destruction to area denial. She was no longer a scalpel or a sledgehammer. She was a fortress wall, forged of titanium and fire. Mover 1 is 2 minutes out, came the call from the chopper pilot. LZ looks spicy, Valkyrie. Can you sanitize it for us? Affirmative, Mover, Eva replied. I'll keep them busy. You just worry about getting our boys home. She descended again, her wings seeming to skim the tops of the rocks. The G8 Avenger, the heart of the warthog, spoke again. Not in a single surgical burst, but in a series of controlled staccato volleys. Each BRRRT was a sentence, a definitive statement that carved a line of death in the dirt 50 yards from Pathfinder's perimeter. Enemy fighters who tried to cross that line were shredded by the storm of 30mm shells. She saw a machine gun team setting up on a small rise, preparing to fire on the landing zone. A flick of her thumb selected her remaining rocket pods. A ripple of high-explosive rockets turned the rise into a crater. She saw a mortar team desperately trying to set up their tube. Another short, brutal burst from the cannon sent the tube, the team, and the earth around them flying into the air. She flew so low that the soldiers of Pathfinder could see the details on her plane's underbelly. The grease stains, the scorch marks, the patchwork of repairs. The downwash from her engines kicked up a storm of dust and pebbles around them. It was a terrifying, beautiful sight. She wasn't a remote, abstract concept of air support anymore. She was a physical, visceral presence, a guardian fighting beside them in the dirt and the blood. The big Z-53 thundered into the valley, its rotors beating the air into submission. It settled into the landing zone, a space cleared and held open by Valkyrie's relentless fire. The rear ramp dropped, and Pathfinder's soldiers, battered and exhausted, scrambled aboard, providing their own covering fire. One of the last men to board was Lieutenant Hayes. He paused on the ramp, turning to look back at the battle. He saw the A-10 bank hard, its wingtip pointing at the ground as it came around for another pass. Tracers were still reaching for it, but they seemed feckless now, desperate. He watched as the cannon fired one last time, silencing a final pocket of resistance that was trying to fire on the vulnerable helicopter. He raised a hand, not in a formal salute, but in a simple, profound gesture of gratitude to the pilot in the sky. All aboard! the crew chief yelled. Hayes jumped inside, and the ramp began to rise. As the sea stallion lifted off, climbing away from the ravaged valley, the remaining soldiers crowded the windows. They watched as the A-10 Fenrir made one final, low pass over the battlefield, a predator surveying its kill before turning to follow them home. It flew beside them for a moment, a silent, gray sentinel, before banking away and disappearing back into the lowering gloom. Silence reigned in the Tactical Operations Center. The frantic energy of the battle had been replaced by a stunned, collective stillness. Every person in the room, from the junior analyst to the senior staff, had been glued to the feeds, Valkyrie's gun camera, the helicopter's forward-looking infrared, and the helmet cam of Lieutenant Hayes. They had just witnessed something that would be spoken of in hushed, reverent tones for years to come. They had seen a masterclass, an impossible problem solved by a singular will. The most compelling footage came from Hayes's helmet cam. It was shaky, chaotic, filled with the terrifying immediacy of ground combat. But through it all, one image was constant. The gray, straight-winged form of the A-10, appearing and disappearing through the smoke, its cannon fire a righteous thunder. They saw the landslide she had created, the precision of her rocket strikes, the sheer, terrifying finality of the GU-8. They saw the wall of fire she had erected around the landing zone. Lieutenant Hayes's voice, raw and breathless, came over the comms one last time as his helicopter cleared the valley ridge. There was no formal report, no tactical summary. Just two words, choked with emotion. Valkyrie. Goddamn. That was it. It was more eloquent than any after-action report could ever be. It was the testimony of a man who had been pulled from his own grave. Colonel Marcus Travers stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the main screen where the A-10's icon was now tracking a steady, uneventful course back to base. His face, which had been a mask of skepticism and then tense concentration, was now unreadable. He had been wrong. Utterly, completely, and spectacularly wrong. His by-the-book, risk-averse models had failed. His scalpels had been turned away. It took the sledgehammer, the wild card, the pilot he had so readily dismissed, to do the impossible. He turned away from the screen and walked back to his personal console. With a few quiet keystrokes, he pulled up Major Eva Rostova's personnel file. He scrolled past the long list of reprimands, his eyes lingering on them for a moment, seeing them now not as signs of insubordination, but as evidence of a mind that refused to be constrained by conventional thinking. He scrolled past the commendations, realizing they were insufficient, pale descriptions of the reality he had just witnessed. His finger moved the cursor to a field near the top of the file labeled Operational Status. The current entry read, Restricted subject to command review prior to high-risk deployments. He deleted it. In its place, he typed two words, Priority Asset. He then moved to another field, Psychosocial Evaluation Notes. It was filled with comments from staff psychologists about her difficulty with authority and maverick tendencies. He appended a new note, his own. Major Rostova displays an unparalleled instinct for aerial combat geometry and tactical problem-solving under extreme duress. Her methods, while unorthodox, are brutally effective. She is not a maverick. She is a master of her craft. He saved the file. It was a quiet, bureaucratic act, but in the rigid, hierarchical world of the military, it was the equivalent of building a monument. It was the system itself, in the form of one of its staunchest adherents, admitting its own limitations and recognizing a form of greatness it couldn't produce, only hope to recognize. He turned back to the room. Get me a wheels down time for Major Rostova, he said, his voice devoid of its earlier edge. I'll meet her on the flight line. The night was cool and quiet on the airbase. The chaos of the day's operations had subsided, leaving only the hum of generators and the distant whine of a jet engine undergoing maintenance. In the stark white light of the hangar floodlights, Fenrir sat ticking and groaning, its metal skin contracting as it cooled. Steam hissed from heat exchangers, and the smell of burnt cordite and hot steel hung heavy in the air. The barrels of the GU-8 were scorched black, a testament to their furious work. The aircraft's skin was peppered with new scars, small pockmarks and long scratches from the small arms fire and shrapnel it had flown through. A maintenance ladder was propped against the nose of the plane. At the top stood Eva Rostova. She had her helmet off, her hair damp with sweat and plastered to her forehead. In her gloved hand, she held a simple rag. She was methodically, gently, wiping the soot and grime from the faded, snarling wolf's eye painted just below her cockpit canopy. She moved with a quiet focus, her expression serene. The ground crew moved around the aircraft with a new kind of deference, their voices low, their movements careful. They were tending to a wounded, legendary beast, and its master was present. The hangar doors slid open, and Colonel Travers walked in, alone. His footsteps echoed in the vast space. He stopped about 20 feet from the A-10's wingtip, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't speak. He just looked. He looked at the fresh holes in the fuselage, at the shredded edge of a wing flap, at the blackened cannon barrels. He looked at the machine that had just defied all of his expectations, that had single-handedly saved 30 of his men. Eva stopped her work and looked down from her perch. Her gray eyes met his across the concrete floor. There was no animosity in her gaze. No, I told you so. There was only a quiet, weary calm. Travers didn't offer congratulations. He didn't say good job or thank you. Words like that felt cheap, inadequate for what had happened. They were the currency of politicians and staff meetings, not of the space that now existed between him, this pilot, and her machine. Instead, he simply looked from the scarred aircraft up to her. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he gave her a single, sharp nod. It was a gesture stripped of all ceremony, all rank, all pretense. It was a nod of pure, unadulterated respect. A soldier acknowledging a warrior. Eva Rostova held his gaze, and then she nodded back, once. A mirror of his own gesture, an acceptance. Then she turned back to her plane, to her ritual, and continued to wipe the grime from the wolf's eye. The colonel stood for another minute, watching her, then turned and walked out of the hangar. The silence he left behind more powerful than any speech, more meaningful than any medal. Respect had been earned. Not in a briefing room with words, but in a valley of death with guns blazing.